Now it's my pleasure to introduce Hanayrá Negreiros and Laura Beltrán-Rubio, who will be in conversation about identity and fashion in Latin America. Hanayrá Negreiros is a Brazilian scholar of Black ways of dressing. She's currently the assistant curator of fashion at the Sao Paulo Museum of Art and a columnist for ELLE Brasil. Laura Beltrán-Rubio specializes in the history of art and fashion in the early modern Spanish world. She's a doctoral candidate at the College of William and Mary. Please join me in welcoming them.
Thank you, Dr. Steele, for the introduction. Thank you, Tanya and Melissa, for the invitation. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. We are very honored and excited to be here talking about our beloved Latin America, or as we sometimes prefer to call it, Uteroyala. And I'm not going to get very deep into it, but Uteroyala is a name that comes from the language of the Gunadule, which is one of the indigenous nations that still inhabits the territories of Canada. And it means perfectly ripe land. And it has been proposed as an alternative that is non-patriarchal, non-anthropocentric, and non-Eurocentric to call Latin America, and probably the Americas more widely. And speaking of non-Eurocentric and indigeneity, we actually wanted to start our conversation with a little anecdote. When we first met to decide what we were talking about, we realized that there is one designer that we both admire immensely, and we actually both wrote about her work for our essays for the catalog that accompanies the exhibition. And we really admire her work because it puts into question what it means to be Latin American. Her name is Diana Molina, and her designs really embody the plurality of Latin America, and at the same time makes us think about the unending legacy of colonialism that we still live throughout the region. And because our subject was identity, fashion, and Latin America, and this is a huge, huge subject, we thought that focusing on Diana's work and using her as a sort of capsule for our conversation would help us guide us through the topics that we want to touch today.
Thank you, Laura, for starting our conversation so beautifully. I am so happy to share this conversation with you. My name is Hanayrá. I'm Brazilian, and I'm so thrilled to be here today. It's my first time in the US, so thank you for having me. Obrigada. And I would like to say thank you to the entire team of the Museum MFIT for this important event. Tânia Melendez Escalante, Melissa Maha Alvarez, and all of you. Well, decolonizing fashion is the concept that drove Molina to create her brand. Laura, can you skip this slide, please, for me? Yes, this is Diana Molina. Beautiful. Decolonizing fashion is the concept that drove Molina to create her brand, Nalimo, 6 years ago. The designer, who is a Brazilian and urban indigenous woman with origins in the Funio, Brazil, and Aymara people in Peru, researches the ancestry of her family, which is formed mostly by women who have always sewn to rescue the family's origins. Molina is a great-granddaughter of a seamstress and has found inspiration in the stories told by the women in her family. She found herself at a crossroad in her youth, realizing that in addition to fashion, other subjects also interested her. Upon learning more about the structural problems present in the Brazilian fashion industry, Molina decided to study social sciences. So she's an artist who connects different points points of view and practices in her work. Breaking with the expectations of what is expected of a unique indigenous fashion. Molina presents an idea of diversity. This is directly linked to the many indigenous peoples present in Brazil.
And I see Diana Molina's work as the proof that there are indeed many identities in Latin America, and that there coexist several fashions, so to speak, or fashion systems in the region. But I think the most important thing about her work is that it shows us that we can reshape how we conceive fashion in Uteroyala, so that indigenous fashion is recognized not only as something that exists, has existed, continues, and most likely will continue to exist in the region, but also that it's an active form of artistic and cultural production today, and that it basically never died out even despite European invasion. And this can be exemplified, I think, in one of Diana's most recent works or designs, which I think is a very, very powerful materialization of indigenous or indigenization of fashion in Uteroyala. The dress is called Útero de Uteroyala, which is basically Uteroyala's womb, would be the translation, and was designed in collaboration with Gabriele Lecoña, which is Diana's assistant, for E! Brazil in celebration of the Met Gala this year. The dress is entirely of dress color. It has a single voluminous sleeve over the right shoulder with undulating borders and resembles the petals of flowers, especially the shoulder part of the dress. It has a red color crocheted flower appliques that border the neckline and the chest, and there are several pom-poms of various tones of red, as well as long fringes, also of different shades of red, that they hang all over the left side of the body, and they represent the bleeding of the uterus and the women. The waist is cinched with a belt with red, white, and black chevron pattern. And in general, the red color, the flowing of the materials, and the volumes and textures in the dress, I think they represent the fertility of women in many ways, but then also the bleeding and the renovation that comes with that. The dress, as I mentioned before, was created in celebration of the Met Gala, and it was presented in a fashion film that was streamed on E! Entertainment and shared on the TV's channel's social media, and you can actually still see it in YouTube if you're interested. And it was modeled by Zahi Wajajara, who is of the Teneteara Wajajara nation, on a very short film featuring also indigenous languages. And the music and the film and the dress all symbolize the giving birth of indigenous women in Uteroyala or in Latin America. And this can be accessed by many people. So I think altogether, the dress and the film and the language and the music, they show us the presence of indigenous people in Uteroyala, and once more they show us how fashion can be done differently.
Yeah, for sure. And it's important to say that in her authorial work, Molina evokes the plurality of Brazil's multiple indigenous presences, as she seeks to break common expectations in the country of what is indigenous fashion. Developing creations with an all-female team, Molina finds different ways beyond graphics to create her brand's language. The approach transits through a mix of traditional and minimalist aesthetics with a color chart that moves between white, black, gray, and red, as Laura said, using traditional and artisanal techniques made with natural materials such as organic cotton and hemp fiber.
The explicit presence of indigenous designers, and especially women, in the fashion scene and museological spaces is essential to reshaping and even decolonizing fashion, not just in Uteroyala, but in the world. And I say explicit, and this is a conversation that we had before, because women have been present all the time, and indigenous women and black women have been present in fashion all the time, but we just don't see them. So seeing them at the forefront, not just as designers like Diana, but also as models, shows us a different way to fashion. And it also points to the fact that fashion does not need to be European or North American to be considered fashion. There are other systems of fashion, and there are other ways of doing and thinking about fashion. And in fact, it could be argued that indigenous fashion is the original fashion, especially in the Americas. And this is something that we take from Siksika Blackfoot curator and art historian Amber Dawn Barerobe, who has written about the need to indigenize fashion in North America or in Turtle Mountain. And she has offered several important strategies to do so that we think can be extended to Latin America or to Uteroyala. And they include, they include specifically that gatekeepers and that the people who tell us what fashion is step aside so that indigenous people come to the forefront of fashion. Not just in the media that are specialized in indigenous fashion, but in the broader media. And that's why Diana's work in the entertainment is so, so important. And I think that's what we can learn from her work. But there's another example that I really admire, and is the collaboration of Anaïs Yucra, who is Peruvian of indigenous descent too, and the Quechua-speaking singer Renata Flores Rivera. And they collaborated for one of the recent videos of one of the singles of Renata Flores Rivera. That's called Chañán Coricoca. Anaïs Yucra, you might have heard of her. She's become very popular recently, among other things, because she won the Positive Impact Project of the Year award at the Latin American Fashion Summit this year that took place in Miami. But I'm not sure if you are as familiar with Chañán Coricoca or Renata Flores Rivera. Chañán Coricoca was actually one of these mythical figures of the Inca. She actively, or so says the legend, she actively fought in support of Pachacútec against the Chancas invasion and attack of Cusco. And she became one of these like motherly figures to the Inca. And then Renata Flores, she is a Quechua-speaking singer. She sings mostly pop and rap in Quechua, and she became very famous because what she started to do was to translate very famous popular pop songs that were in English into Quechua, and she would sing them on YouTube. And then, well, she has become a singer in her own right, and she has her own hits and songs, and Chañán Coricoca builds on the history of this mythical figure. But then also they were inspired for the costumes on the portraits of Chañán Coricoca that survive from the colonial period in museums in Cusco. And so for the warrior look, which is pictured in the center, there's a sort of anaku that would have been the original indigenous dress worn by women in the Inca Empire. Tawantinsuyu has been transformed into a dress, but then they keep some of the important elements. So the 7-point star, there's what would have been a ñañaca or a headdress is now these beautiful feathers of orange color that also symbolize power. And there's the corseted bodies that would not have been present probably in pre-Hispanic Inca times, but is giving power to this warrior figure that Renata and Anaïs created together with their team as well. And then on the left, we have the princess look. And that one takes the reticular structure of the Inca tocapu, which also symbolized the power and importance of the different people that composed the Inca Empire. And then in general, the motifs also include suns and stars and circles that compose many of the pre-Hispanic Inca textiles and Andean textiles more generally. But they are renovating it, and they are presenting it as an alternative for not just indigenous fashion, but for everyone in Latin America to look up to this warrior princess that is so, so important for us.
In the midst of so many perspectives, a question emerges: who has the right and the opportunity to speak and make fashion in Latin America, or ELLE, right? A hot discussion in Brazil about ancestry heritage is happening now. Protagonism and spaces of work, not just inspiration in indigenous or Black and African cultures, for example, like Laura said, but put the people from these origins at the center in these institutions. It's necessary to open up space for racialized people in the places. In a country like Brazil that has been more than 300 years of an enslavement of Black and indigenous people, and lives a current latent genocide of those people, it's urgent that fashion, art, and other segments of culture are used as a spaces of struggle and minority power. I want to bring to this conversation two Black women that I admire and that are a great example for this Blackness in Afro-Brazilian fashion landscape happening right now in Brazil. As you can see in the images, we have sorry, English is not my first language, so. We have in these images a huge presence of white Carol Barreto works. Carol Barreto is an Afro-Brazilian designer from Bahia, one of the most Black states in the country, in Brazil. The designer is also a fashion scholar and created the concept named Moda Ativismo, or fashion activism in a free translation. In the presentation, we can see a photo by the Brazilian photographer Ellen Salomão that shows some of the Axé collection clothes. Axé, it's a word that means vital energy in Yoruba language, a very important concept for the Afro-Brazilian religions like Candomblé. In another image, we can see the creations by Angela Brito with the Archive collection. Brito is a Cape Verdean designer who has lived in Brazil for many years and brings to fashion discussions about the African presence in Brazil, disputing narratives about what would be an African fashion in Brazil. Also updating what I like to think of as a contemporary African diaspora. It's different, the diaspora that happened when the enslaved period. It's happening now with the immigrants, with the African immigrants in the country. Like Molina, with her indigenous work, these both women and another women, Black women in Brazil, are another example of the plural Brazilian fashion scene created by designers that evokes heritages, memories, and spiritualities. The religion, the axé, the energy, the vital energy, it's so important to create a scope about Latin and Latin American fashion. I think that is connected with the concept of identities and with the beginning of our conversation, right, Laura?
Yes, absolutely. And not just with identity, and I think that what we have come to conclude is that when we talk about fashion and identity in Latin America, we have to talk about politics too. And that is very, very important. And the reason why we have to talk about politics, and politics kind of became or become inherent of fashion at this point is because the fashion that is made by Black and Indigenous people and women as well is necessarily political, because the colonialist dynamics in the region have basically erased them. And they have led us, as Hanayrá mentioned before, they have led us to think, or well, we both mentioned before, it has led us to think that whiteness and Euro-North Americanness is what we have to look up to, that it's the only model, that we can only talk about fashion or real fashion if we see or if we try to approach what is being done in Europe and in North America. But then we see these alternatives ways of doing fashion that have existed for centuries in Uteroyala. And so their creations and the bodies of these people that are not white, not European, or that do not necessarily see whiteness and Europeanness as the objective, as where we want to get to, they become politicized. And it's also, there's also this ingredient of they don't really have a choice. If we depart from the norm, then we kind of instantly become politicized, right? I think that's something we've talked about. And then the involvement of these people, and I think in general, the presence of Uteroyala in fashion becomes linked inextricably from political histories, and as Tania and Melissa mentioned earlier, Latin America has been erased basically from the writing of fashion history, and this has also to do with geopolitics of power and broader discourses that inherently start influencing how we think and how we see fashion in general. But then there's also a family ingredient to it, which Hanayrá pointed out when we had our conversations in preparation for this talk too. And we see how through our family heritage, and many of these designers that we presented, through their family heritage, they also carry their own histories, their own stories that can, again, help us point to what identity in Latin America means and how it relates to fashion. And to go back to Anaïs Jucra, whom I mentioned before, she speaks a lot about the indigenous heritage that she carries through the women of her family, who are also the women who taught her to create fashion generally. And so it's these generations of seamstresses and of designers who eventually led her to do the work that she does today. And so here we see that identity and politics are linked very closely, but then also family history and political and social histories become linked very closely as well.
I totally agree, Laura. So for our final treats, to think about identity and fashion in Latin America, or again, as we like to say, Uteroyala, it's to think or rethink identities and fashions in plural and diverse perspectives. The indigenous and Black aesthetics are fundamental to elaborated and fresh narratives. And to finish, I would like to bring the bell hooks and the Samyamere's ideas about decolonization I think it's amazing to clear our minds and paths. It's a quote. The decolonization process only becomes liberating when it involves both parties, right? Breaking hegemonic narratives, building knowledge that's not mediated only by business and capitalism. It's important to say that. Rethinking fashion as a culture and a political act, and bringing diversity to the center of discussion are important steps for starting to decolonize ways of thinking about creative process and to project possible futures. We're talking here about more fresh futures after the pandemic time, right? So art, I think this fashion is right. We are at a museum of fashion, so And thinking about culture to bring this another perspective is so important to break this hegemonical nefastos past of colonialism that we have. So this is amazing opportunity to us to think. I'm so grateful to be here with you, Laura. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, FIT and the audience, for having me, having us. And thank you, gracias, e obrigada, because I am Brazilian, I have to say that in my language.
Thank you.